joining us. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker. My name is Angie Anderson, and I'm with the Mountain Chamber Alliance, which is a group of chambers of commerce in Colorado's mountain region, as the name suggests. So we're really fortunate to be able to have Chris Stifler here today to speak with us about Proposition HH. Chris is a senior economist at the Colorado Fiscal Institute. He got his start explaining economics in 2009, writing an explanatory economics column for his small hometown newspaper in Western Pennsylvania. He is a recently published author of Economics in Other Words, What Your Boring Economics Professor Tried to Teach You. Chris is also a part-time adjunct professor at the University of Denver. So Chris, I will let you take it from here. I believe we have about a half an hour presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So if you want to put your questions in the Q&A, we'll make sure that we get to as many of them as possible. Thank you so much for being with us, Chris.
Thanks for the invite. And so we got two ballot initiatives on the bottom of our ballot, statewide ballot initiatives, Prop HH and Prop II. Just to give you a quick little background about what you're seeing on ballots. Sometimes you see propositions, sometimes you see amendments, sometimes they're labeled with letters, sometimes they're labeled with numbers. Here's just a quick little refresher. If they're labeled with numbers, that means they came through the citizens initiative process. So someone got a bunch of signatures outside the grocery store and then got on the ballot through the signature gathering process. If it has a number, it came that way. If it has a letter like HH and II, it was referred to us by the legislature. So both II and HH are referred to us by the legislature. And if it's an amendment, it would change the Constitution. If it's a proposition, it just changes a law. So Prop HH just changes a law. So we're talking Prop HH. What I see this slide deck as, I think the first 10 slides or so sets up all the complicated stuff that's in HH and understanding HH, because you got to understand how property taxes work and how residential assessment rate work and how the school finance world works and how the homestead exemption works and how Tabor rebates work to truly understand all the complicated moving pieces of HH. So a quick background about the state budget. The state budget, essentially, it's like 5 big departments. When we talk about the general fund or really talk about the state budget, where all our income tax and sales tax goes, we're really talking 35 cents of every dollar we give Colorado go to schools. And the next biggest chunk of our general fund, what the state budget is doing, is our Medicaid. It's about 27 cents of every dollar we give Colorado in taxes. And then we have 3 departments that are always similar in size, between 8 or 9 cents of our tax dollar. That's our higher ed, that's our corrections, and that's our human services. So when you're thinking about the state budget or money for the state budget, what you should really understand is you're paying for schools, Medicaid, colleges, and human services and corrections. And there's more complication with how we fund our schools. We fund our schools both locally and with state sources. So the state sources mostly comes from the general fund, but there's also another education fund called the State Education Fund that pitches in part of the state contribution to school finance. That's important because a lot of the money with a yes vote on HH would go to the State Education Fund and bolster how much money the state pitches in for school finance. But the other side of the funding is the local side, and that's your local property taxes in each school district. So 2 years ago, it was about 40-60 split between local and state. This ratio looks different depending on which school district you're in. You know, Steamboat looks different than Aspen, looks different than Pueblo, but here's the overall statewide ratio. It's important to understand, though, if local falls, if we cut property taxes locally, that impacts the state budget through the school finance world. You'll see in a second how all property taxes are local, but they can impact the state budget through the school finance kind of conduit. Okay. Then we have the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or TABOR, is a constitutional amendment in our Colorado Constitution that we added in 1992. If people know what TABOR is, they know that you can't raise taxes without a vote of the people. So you can't raise new taxes, can't raise new sales tax, no marijuana tax, no rate can go up without a vote of the people in the district. Then TABOR also limits what types of taxes we're allowed to have. It specifically outlaws certain types of taxes that other states use, like graduated income taxes, real estate transfer taxes. You can't have a local income tax. So like Aspen can't have their own income tax. There's several prohibitions of TABOR that says what we can tax and how we can tax. TABOR also sets election provisions. basically tells us when and how we vote on taxes, what the ballot language has to look like when we vote on taxes. And this is the reason why we're voting on II. It's part of those election provisions of Tabor, which I'll explain at the end of the webinar here. And then finally, Tabor caps how big government can grow each year. So Tabor says there's this cap, and the cap grows by inflation plus population growth each year. So like this year, inflation was 8%, population was 1%. So that cap is allowed to grow by 9%. And then all that the state collects in taxes and fees has to stay below that cap. If the state collects more in taxes and fees than that cap allows, the money above the cap gets returned to us taxpayers in the form of Tabor rebates. So here's the chart I'm showing with my arm here, where the referendum C cap is that current cap that caps how big those bars can grow. And those bars represent the taxes and fees that are subject to the Tabor limit. And you can see that like last year, we were about 3.7 billion above that referendum C cap. This year, we're expected to be about 3.5 billion above that referendum C cap. So again, the state can't keep that and give it to schools or roads or higher education funding. It returns that money to taxpayers in the form of Tabor rebates. These are historically large Tabor rebates. Again, we returned 3.7 billion last year, expected to return 3.5 billion this year. Just to give you a history of rebates, the largest rebates we've ever seen in the history of Tabor was back in 2000 when we returned 941 million. Last year, we returned 3.7 billion. So they're 4 times as large as we've ever seen Tabor rebates. So historically large Tabor rebates that we're looking at returning. Okay, this will impact what HH does because HH is going to ask to adjust that cap and allow it to grow by an extra 1%. So essentially, HH will let the state retain more of the revenue that it would otherwise have to give back because of Tabor rebates. Here's how we returned the money last year. Remember those $750 checks that you should have received last August? Well, that was a way of like fast forwarding the money we had to give back because of Tabor. And instead of returning it through your income tax when you filed your income tax in April this year, we returned it early through identical checks to every taxpayer. That was $750, double if you filed jointly. So that was a way of returning 2.7. If you look at the bar on the very left of the slide, that was a way of returning $2.7 billion was returned through those direct $750 checks. So essentially there's like an order by which we return money. The first Tabor rebate mechanism is known as the homestead exemption. It essentially pays for that property tax break we give to seniors called the senior homestead exemption. Those are the people who have lived in their home for 10 years and are 65 and older. They get about a $600 property tax break from that exemption. Well, that is funded in years where there's Tabor rebates out of the Tabor rebate money. And then it was 2.7 billion back in direct checks. And then we still returned about 800 million through the 6-tier sales tax rebate. That's the rebate mechanism. That's the current one on the books that returns money to taxpayers. It divides you into tiers depending on where your income is. And then you get a formula based on what tier you fall into and how much you get. So that's basically the primary funding mechanism. That's the current law on the books for how we will return 3.2 billion of the Tabor revenue next year. So next year, the first thing in order is this property tax break for seniors and some other property tax breaks that were already on the books. And then Tabor says we will return 3.2 billion through that 6-tier sales tax mechanism. Here's a look at what those tiers look like in tax year 23. If you make less than 50,000, you fall into that first tier, and you're expected to get about $628 back under current law. If you fall into the second tier, which is between basically 50 and 100,000 a year, you will get $838. And then you can see it gets higher as the brackets go higher. So someone in the top tier that makes more than 278,000 a year would get $1,984 back under current law, the current law rebates. Just a hint at what HH is going to do. For 1 year, if HH passes, those rebates go to identical, similar to the way we did the identical $750 checks. But if you took that same 3.2 billion and sent it out to people under the identical check system, it ends up being $898. So essentially, a yes vote on HH for the first year would give more to the bottom, to anyone making less than 100, because they'd make more under the identical $900 than they would under the current law. And some more background, HH is also a property tax cut. So to understand property taxes, how they work, you don't pay property taxes on the entire value of your home. You first multiply the market value of your home times the assessment rate. So the current law assessment rate on homes is 6.765%. So that $550,000 home has $37,000 roughly in assessed value. And then your assessed value gets multiplied by the mills. You pay mills to your schools, to your sheriffs, to your counties, to your cities, to your special districts, to your libraries. HH would give a property tax break by exempting some value and also changing that residential assessment rate. By lowering the assessment rate, essentially less of our market value is subject to the mills in the district. And all property taxes are local. This is an interesting dynamic because like our state legislators try to cut property taxes, but they're really not impacting the state budget as much as they're impacting the amount of revenue that goes to your county budgets or your city budgets or your school budgets or your fire protection districts or your libraries. A good rule of thumb on property taxes, it's about 50% schools. If you look at overall property taxes in the state of Colorado, it's about 51% schools. Another 20% of all property taxes go to counties. And then you have about another 20% go to your special districts. That's what we're talking about when we're talking property. It's all local governments. And so here are the high level points of what HH is. In the next slides, I'm going to go in depth on these points and add some numbers. But this is like the high level. You ever read the Cliff Notes version instead of reading the book? Well, I call these Chris Notes. So Prop HH, the first thing of HH is it provides a big property tax cut for both businesses and residential property. It's going to lower the assessment rate, and it's also going to exempt some market value from your home. You'll see in a second on a later slide. But the first thing of Prop HH is a property tax cut. The second big component of HH is it changes that cap. That current cap that caps how much Tabor revenue the state can keep and how much above the cap has to come back to us taxpayers. It grows by inflation plus population. So 8% plus 1% is 9%. A yes vote on HH would allow that cap to grow by an extra 1%. So instead of 9% growth this year, it would give it 10%, an extra 1% growth. And so that effectively allows the state to retain more of that Tabor revenue or more of that bar. And that all that money is dedicated to reimburse local governments for the lost property tax revenue that they lose. Most of it then in the out years is dedicated to the state education fund. And a small bit of it is dedicated to a rental assistance fund. So essentially, most of it goes to schools in the out years, but allows the state to keep some of our Tabor revenue and give it to schools and backfill local governments who lose their property tax revenue from the property tax cuts. It also creates a local limit on how much property taxes can grow in local districts. So there's some exemptions, like home rules are exempt and school districts are exempt, but essentially a lot of local governments like cities and will have a local cap that says they can only grow by inflation. So if they collect more money than inflation that year, they have to have a public hearing and run a resolution that says, yes, we want to keep the revenue. So like if the city of Leadville, grows by 30% this year because their properties went up, well, the inflation rate's only 8%. So if they do nothing, their mills will automatically be cut to match the 8% growth. If they have a public hearing, take testimony, argue why the city of Leadville should keep the money, and then run a bill that says, yes, we want to keep all the money, they can do that. It doesn't require a vote of the people like Tabor would, but it would at least require a public hearing, and arguably some of these local governments will cut their mills because they're growing a lot faster than inflation. That's part of HH. It also essentially makes the homestead exemption portable for people that had the exemption but lost it. So a lot of people had lived in their homes, have had this property tax exemption, but say they downsized or moved primary residence. Well, under current law, they have to wait another 10 years before they can qualify for that homestead property tax break. Under a yes vote on HH would allow the people who had lost it or who had downsized or moved residence not to have to wait 10 years. They would instantly get that same property tax break, just like the homestead exemption. Okay, those are the high level, what I see as the high level points of HH. Here's a little more of the math. On the top right, you see that under current law, the assessment rate, or essentially what percentage of our home is subject to mills, it's set to be 6.765 this year, to go back up to 6.98 next year, and then it goes to 7.15 in the future years. A yes vote on HH would keep that residential assessment rate at 6.7%. So a lower percentage of your market value of your home would be subject to property taxes. And then it also exempts $50,000 the first year, and $40,000 right off the top the second year. So for instance, if you have a $550,000 home in Denver, I ran the numbers. Here's what would be saved from those lower assessment rates and the exemption. So you're talking about $170 the first year, $350, close to $440 in the third year. And that's just the savings from the lower residential assessment rate and the exemptions. Those property tax breaks could be higher if, say, your local government decides to cut the mills to correspond to that local government cap. And then some more details for businesses. The assessment rate on non-residential property, so everything else, basically business property and everything else that's non-residential, it's supposed to go up to 29%. And then it would basically keep that non-residential rate at 27.85%, and then 27.65, and then 26.9. So it keeps their non-residential rate lower than the 29% rate that it would go back to under current law. Or another way of looking at it, just in a different infographic, here's the impact of a yes vote on HH on the average home price in Colorado in 2024. So they have a $560,000 home. A yes vote on HH would get to allow them to exempt $40,000 right off the top. And then that lower market value would be multiplied by the residential assessment rate of 6.7% instead of 6.98%. And then on average, likely you might see the average homeowner lose some mills because of the local government cap. Your local government's cutting mills because they grew faster than inflation, and they had a public hearing and they said, okay, yeah, we want to cut your mills. So there's my guess at what the average, ballpark of what the average home would look like under HH. So we're talking like close to $500 in property tax savings. And the next question then, people are always asking me though, if I get a property tax cut for my home or business property, but aren't I sacrificing my Tabor rebates? And the blue book, again, they mail you a blue book, tells you what's on the ballot, and ballots came out today. Here's the chart from the blue book. Basically, it looks at how much you would sacrifice in your Tabor rebates to allow that extra cap to grow by an extra 1%. So like under current law, yes vote on HH, like someone who makes $100,000. Under current law, they're expected to get $548 back through the 6th tier. If they vote yes on HH, they'd get $500 in Tabor rebates. So they're still getting a very sizable Tabor rebate. It's just lower. The state would be allowed to keep $48 of that, and that's used to go to schools and backfill to reimburse local governments. And so there's your 2-year look. The legislative council that produces the blue book gives you a 2-year look of what you're sacrificing in Tabor rebates, depending on where you fall in those 6 tiers. That's for tax year 24 and 25. But the real question is, though, as that cap grows and grows, it allows the state to retain more revenue each year. And that current referendum C cap diverges from that HH cap. So what I'm showing here is my projections. The HH cap is shown in orange. The referendum C cap, the current law cap, is shown in blue. And then I have 2 projections up here. One in gray shows just steady 5% growth. in Tabor revenue. And then one in blue, I've modeled a recession over that 10-year period. And so your question is, what am I losing in Tabor rebates? Depends on how well the state does and how the economy does over a 10-year period. So I've kind of modeled two bookends just to show you what you're trading off in the future years for the immediate property tax cut that this year. Here's the scenario, very optimistic. Things are great, and we continue to grow by 5%. You can see that it would allow the state to retain an extra $2.2 billion over the 10 years, and 10 years out. Basically, those two caps are about $2.2 billion difference in 32. So it allows the state to retain that extra money, and again, most of it goes to schools, to the state education fund to better fund the state sources for our schools. But if the economy still rock and rolls and grows by 5%, we'd still be given a fair amount of Tabor rebates, but you just lose part of those Tabor rebates. And so what I did is I took the average taxpayer and the average home price and just gave just to look at a 10-year look. So under current law, the average taxpayer would get about $7,000 in my very optimistic scenario. Under HH, they get about $5,000 in Tabor rebates. So they would effectively lose about $2,000 of Tabor rebates over that 10-year period. But then again, they'd also get about a $5,000 property tax cut if they have a median home price. And so under the optimistic scenario, I'm still saying that the average homeowner is going to net more than they would lose in Tabor rebates over that scenario. What I modeled a recession scenario similar to the average historic growth rates in Tabor revenue from the last recession. And you can see the blue bars are actually below the referendum C cap. So in a recession scenario, we wouldn't even give Tabor rebates for 4 or 5 years anyway. So they don't necessarily impact your Tabor rebates if we're not having Tabor rebates under current law. But under that scenario, I figure you actually benefit more from being a homeowner because you're still locking in $5,000 or $4,800 worth of property tax cuts. And the difference between what you're losing in the one scenario under current law Tabor refund scenario versus the under HH scenario is about $400. So I'm still saying that the average homeowner is going to benefit from the property tax cuts more than they'll lose in Tabor rebates. And then, so if we vote yes on HH, the state is allowed to retain more of that revenue under that new HH cap. Again, a lot of that revenue for the first several years goes to reimburse the local governments who lost revenue because of the property tax cuts. So there's a complicated formula, and it really depends on how fast you grow compared to 2022 levels, and also whether you're in a county of more or less than 300,000 in population. There's a different formula on how much reimbursement you get. If you grow by less than 10%, you get like 100% reimbursement. If you grow by 10 to 20%, you get 90% reimbursement. And then there's different formulas that protect ambulance districts, fire protection districts, and health service districts to backfill. Basically, they're trying to protect the small rural local government that didn't see the growth that, say, Denver did by allowing the state to take some of that money it retains from the HH cap and use it to reimburse those local governments. And so the detail on that, where the extra revenue goes that the state would be allowed to retain under the HH cap, it's used to reimburse local governments. 5% or up to 20 million goes to a housing development grant fund to basically do rental assistance. And then majority of the money goes to the state education fund. And this is kind of what the education community is betting on in the next several years, is that a big transfusion of money into the state education fund to better fund our schools through that state side of the school finance formula. And then there's a little just more detail on the homestead exemption. Again, a yes vote on HH would allow the homestead to be portable for those who lost it but changed or downsized to a different primary residence. That's HH. II is the other one that's on the ballot. II has to do with the election provisions of Tabor. Basically, Tabor says if you're going to ask for a tax increase, you have to educate voters on how much the tax increase would raise. And so you're not allowed to deceive voters easy. You're not allowed to deceive voters either. So essentially, you can't say, hey, this new tax will raise 100 million, but in the first year, it actually raised 700 million. That would be deceiving voters under Tabor's philosophy. So Tabor says, hey, if you collect more than you told voters, you have to refund the difference. So those are part of the election provisions of Tabor. So rewind back to 2020 when we passed a nicotine and cigarette tax increase. Well, the economists at Ledge Council said they looked in their crystal ball and projected how much the nicotine tobacco tax would increase. And they told us in the Blue Book that it would raise 186.5 million. Okay. Well, the actual revenue came in higher than they told us. It actually came in at 208 million. So that was 23.65 million more than they told us in the Blue Book. So Tabor says, you deceive voters, you have to refund the difference. So if we vote no on II, we're going to give back a rebate to nicotine distributors and tobacco product distributors. We have to basically refund $23 million to nicotine distributors if we vote II down. II is essentially going to ask voters, are we allowed to keep all the revenue that we collected from that tobacco tax that we voted on 2 years ago, 3 years ago now? Otherwise, we'd have to cut the tobacco tax rate to match the 186.5 million, and then give that 23 million back. A yes vote on II would allow the state to retain it and would go to whatever it was meant to. I think it helps fund early childhood or something like that. Cool. That's my kind of 20-minute deck on HH and II. Are there questions?
Thanks, Chris. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A. So as we go through those, if folks have more, feel free to drop them in there. The first one is, HH seems to make quite a few changes. Doesn't that violate the single subject rule? Can you comment on that?
There was a challenge. I believe there was a challenge, but I believe the court ruled that they could proceed.
Okay.
So I'm not sure the legal theory, but I know it was challenged and they said it was all right.
Okay. And then the next one is for residents that do not own property, and they will not, and their Tabor refund could potentially go down. If the savings from the property owner is not passed down to them, they essentially miss out. So this is more, it sounds like this is just more of a clarification, making that point that renters may not benefit unless their landlord decides to pass savings on to them.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Most renters do fall into that category where they get more under the identical in the first year. And then that small rental assistance fund is pretty small. But yes, homeowners definitely benefit a lot more than renters.
Okay. The next question is, this is with HH. So money's going to an education fund. Does this help all levels of education, including higher education?
State education fund is just K-12. Essentially, though, I mean, you could argue that if you give another $1 billion into the state education fund, it would free up some more general fund money. And going back to the general fund pie we saw on the second slide. So if schools is more from the state education fund, it frees up a little more flexibility in the general fund for anything that the general fund receives, including human services or corrections or a road funding or higher education funding.
Okay. Are there any other questions? That is all that was in the Q&A for the moment. Maybe I'll give it a couple of minutes if folks can think of another question that they would like to ask. Now is your chance. Yes, you gave such a fantastic presentation, Chris, that maybe maybe people are still just pondering the numbers. Oh, here's one. Here's a question. What prompted Proposition HH? Can you describe how it made it to the ballot?
Yeah, I mean, again, it came through the legislature. I think if you do, we're at the Gold Dome this year. That was one of the biggest topics. I mean, we were assessed property every 2 years, and last year was like historically large. And every 2 years, everyone got their property tax like evaluation this summer, and we're like, wow, that's 40% higher than I thought my home was worth. And so we heard a lot of talk about, mitigating those property tax increases. Legislators was top on legislators' priority to somehow give a property tax cut. I think HH was a combination of trying to give a property tax cut, but also finding another funding source for schools, or your local governments, so that they don't lose out on the revenue from cutting property tax. Again, it's a weird dynamic when the state cuts property tax, but it doesn't really impact the general fund. It impacts the budgets of counties and school districts and fire districts. So historically large growth in market value of our homes, I think prompted a need to cut property taxes.
Okay, another question in the chat is, what other groups might be defined as losers if Proposition HH were to pass?
Losers. I think you addressed it. The renters don't get nearly as much as homeowners. Again, it cuts property tax on non-residential, tries to backfill. I don't know. I think you identified the renters probably the biggest non-beneficiaries, losers.
And losers
I can't really.
So. Could you comment on what might be the next step if Proposition HH doesn't pass? What other measures there might be to
Yeah, there's already one initiative that has already got signatures that has already qualified for the ballot in 2024. It's known as Initiative 50 at the moment. That is a very strict growth. I think it's like a 4%. Property tax can only grow by 4%. I view that as a very, very draconian property tax cut that would really hurt fire districts and schools. That's on the horizon for next year. If HHF doesn't pass, I would imagine it's still going to be top of the mind in legislators. I would imagine they're going to do some sort of property tax relief just to mitigate, because this is like the top priority of what a lot of constituents are telling their legislators. So whether that's maybe just exempt 50,000 of value, but then the dynamic is, though, how do we then reimburse the small fire protection district in Eastern Plains that just lost because state legislators exempted their value? So that's going to be part of the dynamic of, is there backfill? Is there not backfill? So for example, the homestead exemption, the local governments don't lose from that homestead exemption. The senior pays $600 less, but the state makes that county or fire district or sheriff's office whole through state sources. So that's part of I'm sure will be part of the conversation. If you give property tax breaks, how do you make the smaller districts, rural districts, whole?
And I think you've already covered this, but do you see any other large downsides to the passage of HH?
We personally support it as Colorado Fiscal Institute. We think one thing, we've tried to get school funding for a long time. We think it's a shame that we're so poorly funded in our schools. This is a clever way of giving property tax break that's high on the minds of voters, but also finding another funding mechanism that backfills our schools and our firefighters.
And can you speak to whether local governments are in favor of this or not?
I think that depends who you ask. I don't think some of the Colorado, what's the one, Municipality League or something, didn't support it. I've talked to some fire districts that are worried because they'll have theirs cut. And I've talked to some fire districts that have grown so far, and they're fine with it, with the backfill or the reimbursements. So I have no consensus on the locals I've talked to.
Okay, another question, just a clarifying question, and I don't know if you have the statistic, but it said, aren't renters 30% of Colorado residents?
I'm sure. I think I looked up data the other day on census data, about 700,000 renters or so, total renters. So what is that as a population? 5.8 million. Yeah, I'm not sure. I would at least think 20 to 30%.
Okay, I think that's the end of the Q and A's. Any more? No more in the queue there. Looks like we've made it through all of them. Well, I'll give one last call, and if we don't get any more in the next couple of seconds, I just want to say thank you again to Chris for taking the time to explain both of these statewide ballot measures, and a reminder to everyone that Election Day is coming up on November 7th. So there are other opportunities to learn about this. We are recording this, so if you want to go back and review it, we will send that out to everybody so that you can dig deeper if you want to. And if you have questions, would you be available to answer questions later, Chris? Okay.
And my email was there. My last name, Stifler at coloradofiscal.org. And we're also going to be traveling around. We're probably going to be busy
Okay.
giving talks around the state. So if you have other groups for us to chat with, we'd be happy. That's part of our mission, is to educate voters on this complicated stuff.
Great. Thank you so much. I believe the Basalt Chamber has something coming up pretty soon. Chris Matera, I don't know if you want to give a quick plug for that. The date, location.
Yes, so the Basalt Chamber of Commerce will be working in partnership with the Basalt Regional Library on Wednesday, October 25th at noon for in-person. I do know many of our Mountain Chamber Alliance partners, I believe Vail Valley Partnership was also looking into one, but other resources are available. And if you can't make it to an in-person session, and I know ours will cover some more of the local ballot issues versus the statewide, or inclusive of statewide. There's plenty of resources online, and we can also push that out to people who have attended this call. There's a lot of really good nonpartisan resources that you can review and make the right choice based on your personal circumstances, because as you've realized in this presentation, it's a little nuanced of how Proposition HH might impact your personal household.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, we encourage everybody to take advantage of those learning opportunities. And once again, thank you so much, Chris, for being here today. And we're on behalf of the Mountain Chamber Alliance, we appreciate your time, and thanks to everybody for joining us today.